What if the nightmares you've been having aren't just dreams? In the small town of Hollowbrook, they've become all too real. A group of friends thought a camping trip would be their escape. But in Hollowbrook woods, something watches from the trees. The woods of Hollowbrook have always been there. Quiet, unremarkable. Just another patch of dense, untamed forest that fades into the background of a small, forgotten town. People live their lives around it, working, sleeping and raising their families, and the woods were simply part of the landscape. They were there, and they stayed there. For as long as anyone could remember, locals told stories about the Hollowbrook woods. Tales passed down through generations, muttered under breaths or shared over drinks in the dim light of old taverns. Stories about people who wandered in and never came out. About strange things seen moving between the trees at night. But they were just that, stories. Myths and legends. The kind of tales that children tell to scare each other on dark nights, huddled under blankets. No one really believed them. Not the way they should have. Not until it was too late. This is the story of four friends. Emma, James, Sophie, and Mark. Friends who had known each other since childhood. Friends who, like many of us, thought they had outgrown their fears. They weren't the kind of people who believed in ghosts or monsters. They didn't buy into the old tales whispered by townsfolk. They were looking for an adventure, a chance to reconnect, to escape the monotony of their everyday lives. But sometimes adventure isn't what you find. Sometimes it's something else, something much worse. It started like any other trip might. They arrived in Hollowbrook on a cool Friday afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets as they passed through the town. Hollowbrook was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound. The hum of the car engine, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant caw of a crow perched on a power line. Emma, sitting in the front seat, felt a shiver run down her spine, but she shook it off. She didn't want to seem nervous. Not yet. James, sitting behind the wheel, had always been the skeptic. He had heard the stories, everyone in Hollowbrook had, but he laughed them off. "Come on," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's just a forest. Trees, bugs, dirt, maybe the occasional raccoon. Nothing to be afraid of." Mark, in the back seat, grinned. He loved this kind of thing. The mystery, the thrill of scaring his friends. He had already planned a few pranks for the trip, just to keep things interesting. He nudged Sophie, who sat beside him, staring out the window. "What do you think? You believe in all this ghost story nonsense?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She was an artist, the kind of person who felt things deeply. She was sensitive to the world in ways the others weren't. The woods made her uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. There was something about them, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice soft, almost distant. "Maybe there's more to this place than we realize." They drove through Hollowbrook and out the other side, down a narrow dirt road that led deeper into the woods. The trees here were old, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long, crooked shadows on the ground. The deeper they went, the darker it got, even though the sun was still up. It felt like the woods were swallowing the light, pulling them in. They set up camp near the edge of a clearing, close to the heart of the forest. The air was still, unnervingly still. Emma tried to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her since they arrived. She wasn't normally afraid of the woods. She'd been camping before, plenty of times. But this place, it felt different. Like the air was heavier somehow. Like they were being watched. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, laughing and talking. The crackling flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Mark was in his element, telling ghost stories and making the others jump with every loud crack of a branch or sudden gust of wind. They tried to laugh it off, but there was a tension beneath their laughter. A tension none of them wanted to acknowledge. Then Sophie noticed something strange. "Look at that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pointed to one of the trees at the edge of the clearing. The others followed her gaze, their laughter fading. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, markings none of them recognized. They were crude, almost primitive, like something scratched into the tree by a trembling hand. "It's probably nothing," James said, trying to sound dismissive, but even he didn't seem convinced. "Kids messing around, maybe. Locals trying to scare the tourists." He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. Mark, always eager to keep the mood light, pulled out his phone and played a sound clip of animal noises, grinning as the others jumped. "Relax, guys," he said, shaking his head. "We're just in the middle of the woods. What's the worst that could happen?" But then, From deep within the woods, they heard it, a long, low growl, echoing through the trees. It wasn't the sound Mark had played. It wasn't the sound of any animal they had ever heard before. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stared at each other, the light from the fire flickering in their wide, fearful eyes. Then Mark laughed again, but this time it was forced. See, it's probably just a bear or something. No big deal. But Sophie wasn't so sure. Later that night, as they lay in their tents, Emma had a dream. In the dream, she was walking through the woods alone, the trees towering above her, their branches twisting and curling like skeletal hands. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, following her as she moved deeper into the forest. She tried to run, but no matter how fast she went, the footsteps grew louder and closer. She turned around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark, endless trees. What would you do if you heard footsteps like that following you in your campsite in the middle of the forest? Tell us in the comments. When she woke up, her heart was racing, her skin clammy with sweat. She sat up, staring into the darkness of the tent, her breathing shallow and uneven. Outside, the fire had burned down to embers, casting faint flickering shadows on the ground. For a moment, she thought she saw something moving in the distance, just beyond the edge of the clearing. A figure standing perfectly still watching. But when she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, they decided to explore the woods. They hiked for hours, weaving through the dense undergrowth, the trees growing thicker and more twisted the deeper they went. The sun barely broke through the canopy, casting long dim rays of light that made the woods feel even more suffocating. It was James who first saw the cabin. It sat deep in the woods, half hidden by overgrown bushes and vines. Its roof sagging, its windows broken and caked with grime. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like no one had set foot inside in years. "Let's check it out," Mark said, already heading towards it. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The floor was littered with old, crumbling photographs, their edges curling and yellowed with age. The faces in the photos were blurred, unrecognizable. Sophie knelt down, picking one up. The image was faded, but she could just make out a group of people standing in front of the very cabin they were now in. None of them looked familiar. James, ever the curious one, started rifling through the debris. In one of the drawers, he found a journal. Its pages were worn and brittle, the writing faint and smudged. As he flipped through it, his expression changed. "Listen to this," he said, his voice low, reading from the journal's final entry. "It watches us. It waits." They exchanged uneasy glances, the air in the cabin growing colder, heavier. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. That night, strange things began to happen. As the group finds the journal, do you think they should keep going deeper into the woods? Let us know in the comments. The next day brought no relief. Emma, Mark, Sophie, and James set out early, determined to leave Hollowbrook behind them. Emma, as always, took the lead, her compass in hand, her eyes fixed ahead. She was the one everyone relied on to stay calm, to keep control. But today, even Emma couldn't shake the tension. The forest felt different. It seemed to be closing in around them, the trees taller, thicker, casting deep shadows that made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. For hours they walked. Yet no matter which direction they took, they kept ending up in the same place. It was a clearing they hadn't seen before, dominated by a massive dead tree at its center. The tree stood like a monument to something long forgotten, its bark cracked and blackened, its branches bare, stretching out like skeletal arms. There was something unnatural about it. Emma's heart raced as she studied it, but she said nothing, unwilling to let the others see her fear. Mark, however, was beginning to break. He muttered under his breath, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He was convinced they were being followed, though every time he turned, nothing was there. Just the woods, silent and still. He tried to joke, tried to brush it off, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I swear," he said, his eyes wide, darting from shadow to shadow. "I keep seeing something. Someone. Just out of sight." The others didn't respond. What could they say? They all felt it, the oppressive weight of the woods, the sense that they weren't alone. But no one wanted to admit it. As the sun began to sink behind the treetops, casting a dull orange glow through the branches, the tension reached its peak. They were walking in silence when it happened. Without warning, James was yanked off his feet, dragged into the thick undergrowth by an unseen force. His scream ripped through the air, sharp and sudden, before being cut off as if it had never existed. For a moment, the others stood frozen, staring at the spot where James had been. Then chaos. James! Emma screamed, running toward the place where he'd vanished. But there was no trace of him. No trail. No broken branches or disturbed leaves. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. She turned, her face pale, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. We need to go. Now. But it was too late. Something had shifted. Sophie stood apart from the others, her back to them, staring at the dead tree in the center of the clearing. Her body was rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. She was muttering to herself, words too low and too fast for Emma or Mark to understand. They called her name, but she didn't respond. Her head tilted slightly, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Emma approached her cautiously. "Sophie," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to go. Sophie, we need to." Before she could finish, Sophie turned to face her, and Emma stumbled back. Sophie's eyes were wide, unblinking. Her expression blank. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was deeper, raspier, speaking in a language Emma didn't recognize. Mark backed away, shaking his head. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sophie stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, but her eyes were vacant, distant. "It's too late," she said, her voice soft but filled with a strange, unnatural calm. "It's already here." Emma and Mark exchanged a panicked glance. The weight of those words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. They knew deep down that Sophie wasn't speaking to them. She was speaking for something else, something they couldn't see, but that they could feel, watching them from the shadows. In the distance there was movement. The creature that had been stalking them was no longer content to stay hidden. It emerged slowly from the woods, its form shifting in the dim light. It was massive, its body hunched and twisted, its limbs long and gnarled like the branches of the dead tree. Its face was indistinct, constantly shifting between shapes, sometimes human, sometimes monstrous. And its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body wouldn't move. She could feel the creature's presence pressing down on her, a cold, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Mark stood frozen beside her, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth moving soundlessly as if trying to form words. Sophie, still smiling that twisted smile, began to walk toward the creature. Emma grabbed her arm, tried to pull her back, but Sophie jerked away. Her strength unnatural. "It wants us," she whispered, her voice distant. "It always has." Emma's mind raced. They had to get out, had to find a way to escape, but every path led back to the clearing, back to the dead tree. The woods had them trapped. Desperation clawed at her chest as she grabbed Mark's arm. "We have to run," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here." But as they turned to flee, Emma stumbled. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she found herself falling, crashing through the underbrush. When she finally came to a stop, she was alone. The trees loomed above her, their branches twisted and gnarled, their shadows long and dark. She stood, her legs shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had no idea where she was or how far she had run, but one thing was clear. She was lost, and she was alone. Or so she thought. It wasn't long before she saw it, the dead tree, standing tall in the middle of a clearing. The same clearing she had tried so desperately to escape. The same clearing where James had disappeared. Emma's heart sank. She could hear Mark's voice in the distance, calling her name, but she didn't move. She knew deep down that the forest wouldn't let them leave. And then, through the silence, came a whisper. Faint at first, carried on the wind, but growing louder with every passing second. It was Mark's voice, but it wasn't coming from the direction she had heard him call out. It came from the shadows, from the trees. His voice, repeating the same words over and over, barely more than a breath. "We never should have come here." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. The creature. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her, its form shifting and twisting in the dim light. Its eyes were hollow, empty, but somehow, she could feel its gaze boring into her. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. And as the wind picked up, carrying Mark's whispered words through the trees, she understood the truth. Hollowbrook woods had claimed them, and they were never leaving. The air in the clearing was thick with an eerie stillness, the kind that makes every breath feel heavy, weighted by an unspoken dread. Emma stood at the center of it, her heart pounding, the dead tree looming above her like a sentinel of some forgotten era. The twisted branches seemed to reach out, casting skeletal shadows that danced on the forest floor, mocking her desperation. She had heard Mark's voice, his familiar comforting voice, but something was wrong. The way it echoed through the woods, distant and warped, sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't him. Not really. It was the forest. It was toying with her, bending her sense of reality, of time. The wind carried whispers now. Faint, indistinct, but somehow familiar. They brushed past her ears like fingers tracing cold lines down her skin. We never should have come here. The words repeated, over and over, like a broken record, but they weren't warnings. They were promises. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her as she took a hesitant step away from the dead tree. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable. Soft, as though it could give way at any moment. Every instinct told her to run, to find the others, but her body resisted, trapped by some invisible force that seemed to bind her to this place. Suddenly, a glint of something caught her eye, a flash of stone, weathered and covered in moss, barely visible beneath the tangled roots of the tree. Emma crouched down, her hand trembling as she brushed away the dirt and leaves, revealing what had been hidden for so long. A gravestone. Her breath caught in her throat as her fingers traced the faded letters carved into the stone. The name was hers. Emma Croswell. The date below it, faint but legible, was from more than 50 years ago. Impossible. Her mind reeled, struggling to make sense of it. How could this be? How could her name be here, etched into a grave that predated her own life? The realization clawed at her chest, a suffocating fear that twisted and tightened until she could hardly breathe. And then she heard it again. That voice. Welcome home. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, distinct, and far too familiar. She spun around, her eyes darting wildly through the shadows, searching for the source. But there was no one there. Just the trees, silent and unmoving, and the cold, creeping sense that she wasn't alone. The voice spoke again, closer now, as though it was just behind her. Emma! Her breath quickened, her pulse racing as the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the forest spinning around her. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. She stumbled backward, away from the gravestone, her mind racing. But with each step, the whispers grew louder, the voice more insistent, more commanding. You never left. Panic surged through her. She had to get out. Now. She turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at her skin as she ran. Not caring where she was going, only knowing she had to escape. But no matter how fast she ran, the trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted forms growing denser, darker. The forest was alive, shifting, changing, trapping her in its endless maze. And then she saw it again, the dead tree. She had circled back to the clearing. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, terror clawing at her mind. There was no escape. No matter where she ran, the forest brought her back to the same place, over and over, as though mocking her, taunting her with the inevitability of her fate. And then from the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, barely visible against the darkness of the woods. But as it stepped closer, the dim light revealed its face. James. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, his eyes wide and hollow. But something about him was off. He moved too stiffly,